those affected by mitochondrial disorders, UMDF is here for you. Since 1996, we've worked to provide support, fund research, and create awareness.
Our mission is to promote research for cures and treatments of these diseases and to give support to affected families.
We want future generations to grow up in a world without mitochondrial disease.
I'm playing for the United Mitochondrial Disease Foundation.
Look at that. Nice check for you.
Over the years, our community has grown and our message has sparked a movement.
Hey everybody, it's Maya Mialik. Have you ever heard of mitochondrial disease?
Together, we've been able to make a difference for patient families around the world. Today, we are helping thousands of people navigate their mitochondrial disease journey. We're here, listening and providing support. We're here, educating and connecting patients and healthcare providers. We're here, finding and funding the best cutting-edge research. We will not rest until we find a cure. Join the movement at umdf.org.
Hi, everyone. I am welcome to UMDF's Ask the Mito Doc for September of 2020. Tonight's topic is going to be handling Mito in a COVID world. I'm Phil Yeski, the Science and Alliance Officer. I'll be your moderator tonight. I'm actually standing in for Cliff Gorski, and I think we all know what a great job Cliff usually does with this. So I'll do my best to stand in here. We have a great program that's going to make it a lot easier for me. And we really hope that you get the most out of it in this really challenging time for everyone. Just to summarize the program, we're going to start with a presentation by Dr. Alex Dorenbaum of Reneo Pharmaceutical. And then we're going to transition to a group of presentations from representatives of the University of California, San Diego. And I'm sure many of these names are familiar to you within the mitochondrial disease community. Doctors Richard Haas and Annette Feigenbaum, also research coordinators Gail Reiner, Jessica Wright, and genetic counselor Sophia Solomons. So we'll have presentations from them, and then we'll be sure to have leave time for Q&A after that. So just a little bit of housekeeping. The question and answer format will be as follows, just to make it a little more orderly. You're going to be muted when you come in. Please use the Q&A function that you see at the bottom of your screen to submit questions during the webinar. Only the hosts and panelists will be able to see this. And then at the end, we'll present questions to the speaker for responses at the very end of the presentation. Of course, we always have to thank our sponsors who make programming like this possible at UMDF. The Edith L. Trees Charitable Trust, Astellas, Modus, a Zoogenics company, Tishcon, Reneo, S. Pope Babcock Foundation, and many others listed here on the screen. Again, it's their generous support that allows us to provide this programming. I just wanted to quickly mention that if you were not able to join us live for our Power Surge event that took place at the end of June, the video of that and the respective speakers are still available online. And there's a lot of great content there. And I encourage you to go in and consume it as you have time. You don't have to watch the whole thing. You can pick and choose which ones you want to see. But the links are shown here on the screen, and really hope that you can find some time to do that. We spent a lot of time talking about clinical trials, and that's going to be the focus of tonight's first presentation, is an upcoming clinical trial there. Also have to take a moment, of course, and remind you that in this pandemic time, the ability to do Energy for Life walks, which are so important to us as an organization and to you as a community, because we know it's a social opportunity, a networking opportunity. Unfortunately, they need to be transitioned to being virtual. And that's challenging, but the team at UMDF has worked really hard to build virtual Energy for Life walk programs that I think you'll still find very useful and valuable to you. So please sign up in your area if you can. Also want to take a moment and remind you, in case you didn't know, next week is Global Mitochondrial Disease Awareness Week. That starts on September 13th, runs through September 19th. UMDF has a full week of programming. You'll see that through social media. You'll see that in various venues and webinars that we're hosting. please check the UMDF Facebook page, share, as we like to say, because this is all about awareness. And so every contact we make is a step forward for our disease community. Lastly, a couple save the dates with fingers crossed that next year we will be able to return to an in-person symposium. So those dates are locked down June 23rd to 26th in Charlotte, North Carolina. We really hope that the pandemic sort of clears itself, that we're able to bring people together. We have a great program we're putting together. I'm working with Kara and others at UMDF. I'm pulling the scientific program together for that, as well as the family program. And it's our 25th anniversary. So we want that to be a really special program. So stay tuned on that front. Our intention is to bring everybody together next June in Charlotte. And then lastly, our next Mito Doc webcast is Making the Most of the Holidays, and that's scheduled for October 7th, 2020, 5 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Central, 8 p.m. Eastern. We have several speakers from Mayo Clinic lined up. You see them listed on here, and they'll be kind of talking about, again, this general theme of making the most of the holidays. Should be a really great program too. So I would be remiss if I didn't thank you for joining us. These support programs are really a core part of the mission of UMDF. I spend a lot of time on the research side, but it's great to be with you here tonight and participate in this support program. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Alex Dornbaum. He's the Chief Medical Officer at Reneo Pharmaceuticals, and he's going to tell you about a clinical trial that they're planning around mitochondrial myopathy. So Dr. Dornbaum, I am going to go off video and turn it over to you, and you can share your screen.
Let me know if I'm sharing now.
Yes, you're good.
Yes, excellent. Let me see. So, yeah, excellent. So I want to thank the organizers for inviting us to participate in this meeting, and we're very excited to share with you the progress of our company and where we are at this point and what our plans are. It's been, as you all know, challenging with the pandemic and working through this whole process. But by way of introduction, Reneo is a clinically stage young company. We're focusing on genetic mitochondrial diseases, and we began operations in 2018. We're a group of physicians and scientists that have worked together in other programs before. Our model is to get drugs that big pharma develop for a large indication, and they abandon development for business reasons. And what we do is we adapt these drugs to treat rare diseases. Now, the advantage of doing this is that by the time we acquire the drug, we already know a lot about the drug and how it works. And we have a fairly extensive safety and pharmacology package. We have advanced work in understanding the chemistry, the manufacturing, and the quality of the drug itself. And we understand the PK, that is how a drug is absorbed, how a drug is distributed and eliminated from the body. And that allows us to really get going fairly fast in the process of developing the drug. This drug has already been tested in people, in healthy volunteers. And in fact, we've completed a phase 1 study in PMN patients as well. Now, the drug that we are developing is a PPAR delta agonist. And that means that the drug stimulates the activity of the PPAR delta receptor. That's what agonists mean. PPAR delta is a receptor that sits near the genes of the cells, particularly the muscle cells. And when you trigger this receptor, the genes in the muscle get activated and they increase their activity. And the genes that get activated by PPAR delta are genes that modulate or control the activity of the enzymes in the mitochondria that use fats as fuel to generate energy in the form of ATP. So if you stimulate PPAR delta, you stimulate genes that stimulate the activity of the mitochondria, and the mitochondria produce energy more efficiently. It is also believed that PPAR delta can activate the formation of new mitochondria in the cell, and it can also modify the muscle to be a more efficient muscle during exercise. So altogether, these changes may be important in patients with PMM who have problems with mitochondrial function. And besides PMM, there are other patients with genetic diseases that affect the mitochondria. And we are actually conducting studies in patients with PMM, but also we're also doing studies in patients with fatty acid oxidation defects. These are patients, the patients with FAUD, that have an enzyme defect in the enzymes that metabolize large fats in the body, and they have an energy deficit. And also patients with McArdle disease that have a different kind of defect, but we think that by improving the function of the mitochondria in these patients, we may benefit them as well. So we've completed the first PMM study. We saw improvements in exercise tests and in symptoms. I'll talk a little bit more about this in the next slides. And we've had conversations with the regulatory agencies as we are moving forward, and we're very excited that we have a green light at this point to move forward in the development of our program. For FAUD and for McArdle, we started the studies. Unfortunately, the COVID pandemic hit us very hard, and we did see some preliminary evidence of efficacy in the patients with FAUD, but there were only a few patients enrolled in that study, and we need to expand that study to really decide how to move forward in the future. McArdle, we had just begun enrollment in the study when the pandemic hit, and we had to stop. But this is a study that is being done primarily in Europe. And interestingly, Europe managed the pandemic a little differently than us. And one of the centers in Spain, for instance, is now open and beginning to enroll patients again. So we're hoping to gather data for these diseases in the near future as well. Now, let me talk a little bit about the study we did in patients with PMM. The primary objective of this study was to evaluate safety and tolerability. It was the first time we ever gave this drug to patients with PMM, so we wanted to make sure it was safe. And indeed, it turned out to be very well tolerated by the patients. But we also collected data on exercise tests and symptom questionnaires. And this was an open label study, meaning all the patients received the drug. We didn't separate patients to receive a dummy medicine, a placebo, or a drug. Everyone in this study received the drug. As you know, mitochondrial diseases come in many flavors, and we enroll only patients who had mitochondrial gene defects in particular. We think these are the patients that stand to benefit most from the mechanism of action of our drug. Patients received REN-001, the drug, for 12 weeks in part A of the study, and they had the option to continue treatment in an extension study. Here's a list of the outcome measures we included in the study. We did walk tests and other exercise tests that measure the fitness and endurance of the patients before and after treatment. And we also used questionnaires that focused on quality of life and on fatigue of the patients. The study was relatively small. We enrolled 23 patients. 17 of the patients completed the study, and of these, 13 received treatment for almost 40 weeks. Some patients were not able to complete the study because of the COVID, and we had to terminate the study a little bit early because of the pandemic. But the data that we collected, we believe, is sufficient for us to learn about the drug and in the patients and to be able to move forward. In general, I can say that REN-001 was safe and well tolerated in the patients with PMM. We saw clinically important improvements in the walk tests and in the other exercise tests. Also, we saw meaningful improvements in the symptoms and in the quality of life of the patients. And the majority of patients who took part in the first part of the study decided to continue treatment in the extension study. And as I said earlier, the data that we obtained has helped us design the program moving forward and initiate our conversations with all the regulatory agencies in different countries to be able to implement the next trial. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the next trial that we are planning. So moving forward, these are our plans. We're preparing to start a double-blind placebo-controlled trial. What that means is in this study, we will be randomizing, we will by chance assigning patients to receive medicine or to receive a placebo so that we can compare both groups and decide if the drug is working well in these patients. The study will enroll about 200 patients with mitochondrial gene defects. This will be a study for adults, 18 years and older, with a history of myopathy. The study will include about 30 centers in North America, in Europe, and in Australia. And we plan to include primarily a walk test and symptom questionnaires to evaluate the response to the drug in the patients. We've done most of the groundwork to get the studies approved in multiple countries. That includes talking to the regulatory agencies like the FDA in the United States and similar agencies in other countries. We've had very good interactions with these groups, and we plan to have multiple sites in the United States, including a site in San Diego. I know the San Diego crew will talk right after me, and Dr. Haas has been a supporter of this program, and his center will participate in this study. If all goes well, centers will be ready to enroll patients by the beginning of next year, in a few months from now. And it is possible that some centers may be able to start earlier, and it all depends on the COVID pandemic, of course. We're very excited about getting this program going, and we think that this drug has the potential to really benefit patients with PMM. So I want to thank the organizers, and I want to thank you for your attention, and hope to be able to give you more updates as we progress with our studies in the months to come. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Dornbaum, for that really exciting update from your company. I think for our community, of course, this is a really exciting time when we see new drugs coming forward, investigational drugs towards clinical trials. And of course, we look forward to further details, but the first quarter of 2021 is not very far away, and it'll be great to get that started. Before we transition to the second set of speakers, I just want to remind everyone on the call, you can submit questions. Dr. Dornbaum is going to stay on. We're going to hold questions for his presentation till the very end, but please submit them through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. That's where we'll capture them all, and then we'll try to cover as many of them as possible once we finish up the University of California, San Diego presentations. So without further ado, Dr. Dornbaum, we're going to ask you to go off. You've released screen sharing, and I believe, Jessica, you're going to take over. Our first speaker from University of California, San Diego is Jessica Wright, and she is a clinical research coordinator there, and she will move the presentations along through the other speakers from UCSD. So, Jessica.
So
you can see.
Yep, that's fine. So actually the sequences that I'm going to lead off with, and
I mean, Dr. Richard Haas.
So it's really important to get to Jessica. And I want to thank Dr. Dornbaum for telling us about the RENIO study, which is really very exciting, and we're doing our best to get up and running as soon as possible. I think when RENIO is ready, we'll be ready. So just go back a slide, Jessica. So I'm leading off. We also have Dr. Feigenbaum, who has worked alongside us for many years. She runs the metabolic clinic at UCSD and Rady Children's Hospital. Jessica is a lead clinical trial coordinator for our group. Sophia works at Rady Children's Hospital as a genetic counselor. And I thought it was really important to have her join us because she can explain really the incredible value that genetic counselors bring to our program. And Gail Reiner is a nurse practitioner who has worked with me for many years and looks after, along with our group, a lot of mitochondrial disease patients and has been heavily involved in clinical trials. So that's the group who'll be chatting with you today. I want to, next slide, cover just a few issues. So really to discuss what has changed since this nasty COVID thing has come along. And of course, the leading thing in all of our lives is COVID precautions. We have to now be very cautious about interacting with other people and patients. One downside of the whole thing is that a lot of families and patients are afraid to come to the hospital. And actually, in an outpatient setting, I think that is one of the safest places you can be because we're very, very cautious about interacting with patients. We wear face masks, of course, and I'm going to go into that a little bit, but also shields, face shields, and gloves, and disposable coats. So we're very careful not to get infected and also not to infect our patients. And because so few people are actually coming to the clinics, they're pretty empty, actually. It's really a very safe place to be. So if you're not doing well, I would encourage you to go see your doctor and don't be afraid to go to the clinic. They're basically super safe places. The other thing, of course, that is a major change is the advent of telemedicine. A number of us have been playing with that in the past to some limited extent, but COVID has really opened up the whole opportunity here for healthcare providers and for patients, particularly sick patients, not to have to make a trek into the clinic. And the federal authorities have relaxed the HIPAA regulations, so we can do this at the moment anyway, across state lines as well, which is very helpful for patients who are traveling from out of state or would be traveling from out of state. So we're doing a lot of telemedicine, and there are advantages. The advantages, of course, as I've listed, are that the families don't have to move from their homes. But the disadvantage is that we can't physically examine them. So we have to kind of do a video examination. This is particularly a problem for new patients that we're trying to evaluate because we really need to have a very good look at you to understand how you're being affected by mitochondrial disease. And then for follow-ups, the examination is not quite so important because we already know what the problem areas are, and we're dealing more with symptoms and management with medications. So telemedicine in general is better for follow-up evaluations, and ideally for a new patient evaluation, it'd be best to see you in the clinic, although we do wind up doing a number of telemedicine initial evaluations as well. It seems to take quite a lot longer to do these telemedicine visits. Part of the time is spent in people getting used to the idea and making the technology work. Often our patients have difficulty with that. And so do we at the hospital end. So that leads to a delay, and you'll often find that you're waiting for longer than you would hope to be waiting for to actually see your doctor on a telemedicine call. There are lots of other delays in our life now because of COVID. So university systems and administrators and hospital systems in general are not working very efficiently at the moment. One example is that many of the administrators are working from home, and so you can call their office as many times as you like, and they're not going to be picking up the telephone, and so you communicate through email, which they may or may not be looking at. So everything is kind of slowed down in that respect. And that to some extent is affecting clinical trials. Although our clinical trial administrators on the university side are staying pretty much on top of it, and the IRB, the Investigational Review Board, is just about as accessible to us as it has been in the past. So some things are working quite well. And we're continuing to see patients in our clinical trials in the UCSD Clinical Research Center, which remains up and running through the whole COVID era here. And I'm going to show you a picture of one thing that they're doing to try to keep everything safe for the patients and the doctors. And finally, I just want to say a word about face masks, which we'll get to in a minute. So next slide, Jessica. So this is the entrance, one of the two entrances to the Clinical Research Center at the University of California in San Diego. And you can see that they have a one-way system here so that nobody is walking towards you with their face exposed. And you can also see that it is fairly empty. There has been an impact on clinical trials. But this is really an incredibly safe place to participate in a clinical trial. And we're really looking forward to getting the RENEO and the other clinical trials that we're working on up and running. And then finally, Jessica, next slide. I'd just like to talk about the safest things that you can do and your family can do in terms of protecting yourself. So the regular cloth face masks that most people are wearing are helpful for protecting other people because they prevent the spread of droplet particles. At least they impair the spread of droplet particles. But they're not very good at protecting you. And I feel quite strongly that mitochondrial disease patients and families should be wearing either N95 masks that are not all that comfortable, or KN95 masks, which just loop over your ears and basically filter out 95% of the particles. That's what the 95 means. And you can get these very easily on Amazon. There are several suppliers. Some are made in the US, even in Arizona. There's a company that makes these. I really do advise my patients and families to try to protect themselves as well as other people by wearing this kind of mask when they're out interacting with anybody who's not an immediate family member. So having said all of that, I'd like to hand over to the person who really has some useful stuff to tell you about with clinical trials, who is Jessica. So Jessica, if you could take the floor. Thank you.
Sure. So hopefully everyone can hear me okay. I was just going to talk briefly about the way COVID has impacted clinical trials. So here at UCSD, I am involved with a lot of Mito trials with Dr. Haas, but also some other neurology focused clinical trials. And overall, clinical trials are really not able to halt all of a sudden very easily. There's a ton of work that goes into even getting ready to conduct a clinical trial. So they can't just, cease to operate. So due to this, when COVID hit, they had to find ways to kind of work around all the challenges. So one thing that I think will be convenient for patients moving forward is home nursing services, which have been used for a long time, but haven't been, I don't think, used as much as they could be. And COVID has made them really more central to most studies. So most studies that I'm aware of that are preparing to get started now have built in opportunities for nurses to be sent out to patients' homes to collect blood. Sometimes they can even do EKGs, collect vital signs. So that's really convenient. And I think that will continue probably into 2021 at least. Another convenient thing is courier services, which can be used to ship medicines to patients. A lot of medications that have been tested for mitochondrial disease have to be refrigerated or have to be handled in very specific ways. So there's companies, it's not FedEx or UPS, there's specific companies that just do this all day. They just ship medicine to people all across the US, which is especially convenient for us since a lot of patients come from different states often, or different parts of California. And so basically the main concerns that are being weighed are, is it worthwhile to have families travel to us, patients travel, even if they might have to fly or drive really long distances to get a full physical exam, a full neuro exam, and everything else that they can get on site? Or is it better to be more cautious and send a home nursing service to go see them at home? Because some things we just can't do remotely. The home nursing service can't do things like MRIs, CT scans. They can't do all of the walk testing that is a part of a lot of mitochondrial disease trials. But when people do come in person to our research clinic that Dr. Haas just showed the photo of, if the visit is beyond a certain number of hours, which I think is 2 to 4 hours, I'm not sure currently, it keeps changing, but you have to get actually COVID tested before you come, which is not a huge issue. UCSD has a lot of different drive-through COVID testing centers where people can go get the nasal swab and then they get the results fairly quickly. And everyone coming to the clinic has to be screened for any symptoms of COVID. They have to wear a mask, of course, and they have their temperature taken by the admin person at the front desk, so you can't get in without doing that. One thing that's inconvenient mostly, and I think especially for the pediatric trials, is that guests are limited. So for example, I have one study for kids with severe autism right now. Usually they would like to bring sometimes both parents, a behavioral therapist, a whole crew of people. But due to COVID, they can only usually bring one parent or caregiver. So that's a little inconvenient, but they can still come in for their visits. And I think the main thing that the main way that COVID has affected clinical trials is that new trials that we had hoped would get up and coming and going maybe early in 2020, or by now at least in mid 2020, are being pushed back. But we are hoping at UCSD to start a few trials for mitochondrial disease by around the end of this year or the start of next year. And I do think for patients out there listening, that when these studies start, they're going to be really eager to get going and to meet their enrollment goals very quickly since they've been delayed. So be ready to go if you're interested. So if you are interested in participating, I would suggest that you let your specialist know if you have a Mito specialist who you see, and you can gather your medical records, including, and I think Gail will speak more about this, but having results of genetic testing is super important. That's required for, I think, every study that I'm aware of that we may be participating in. And then I think just making a personal determination of if you would like to participate, even if you had to travel to do so. If you had to drive really far to come to a site, if you had to fly, would you like to do that? Would you be comfortable? that's just a personal decision, of course, or you could also discuss with your physician. And then there are resources where you can find lists of clinical trials, which I've shown here. I think people are probably, I hope they're aware of clinicaltrials.gov, but if you're not, I use clinicaltrials.gov all the time and it's wonderful. And I would just suggest that you check it out sometime. You can put in, if you start typing Mito, it will populate mitochondrial diseases for you. And you can put in your country, you can put in California is what I put in here. And I would just suggest that you look for recruiting and not yet recruiting studies. Otherwise, you'll get like thousands of studies that have ever been done on the topic. And I did this and looked at just the US, not California, and found that there's 38 studies for mitochondrial disease that are recruiting or not yet recruiting. So they're out there and more are added all the time. And UMDF, a little shout out, also has a page for clinical trials and presentations about it. I saw that there's one coming up about another research study. So that's another good way to learn about trials. And I will pass it over to Sophia.
Hi, thank you. And thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here and to be part of the team. I've been at Rades for just over 5 years and in genetic counseling as a profession for over 10. And healthcare genetic counselors are, not always people have heard about genetic counselors. So I thought to talk a little bit about what genetic counselors are and then kind of go through a case just to give you an example. You can go to the next slide, thank you. Genetic counselors in general are healthcare providers where graduate trained. Our training usually includes training in social work and counseling, but also the molecular and human genetics aspect of it. And so we exist in a lot of different specialties. Genetics is growing across lots of parts of medicine. And so you can see that in the genetic counseling field too, where there's genetic counselors in the prenatal world, in pediatrics, in cancer genetics, but then also in obviously Mito and across many different specialties. There's genetic counselors in the clinical world, seeing patients and their families. There's also genetic counselors working for laboratories, for different patient advocacy organizations, for different legal organizations, and also health insurance companies. So there's genetic counselors in lots of different areas. And you may have met a genetic counselor as part of your own workup or your child's workup, or maybe even a genetic counselor for something completely separate than mitochondrial. Next slide, please. I thought to kind of go through an example because it can be a little bit difficult to know what a genetic counselor might do. So here is Abby, and Abby is a little girl. She's just under 1, and she had a very uncomplicated pregnancy and delivery, and there weren't any health issues or concerns. She had her well checks. There weren't concerns about her development until a couple months later when she contracted a viral infection that was not COVID. And she started to lose some of the things that she had learned to do. She lost the ability to feed. It used a lot of her mouth muscles. She lost some head control. She had some episodes of vomiting and she had a seizure. And as part of her workup, she also had a brain MRI that showed some features that made her team concerned about a mitochondrial disorder. And she also had an elevated lactate in her blood that was later also seen in her CF, or in her cerebrospinal fluid. So as part of her workup, she saw a genetic counselor, and this is her family history. It's a tool that we use in genetics because we're learning a lot about our genes all the time, but our family history can sometimes give us some clues about what's happening, even when we don't necessarily know about the genes yet. So in genetic counseling, a family history is drawn with some shapes. So we do some art every day. The circles are girls, the squares are boys. And in this case, Abby is here with the arrow. She's shaded in because she has the condition that we're interested in taking the family history. You can see she has a mom, she has a dad. Her mom is the circle with the number 30 under it. She's 30. Her mom has a brother and mom's parents are living. And then on Abby's dad's side, she has her dad has a sister, and then dad's mother, or Abby's grandma, passed away for unrelated medical issues or unrelated non-medical issues, and then her dad is there too. But you can see that there aren't a lot of clues here in Abby's family history immediately that would make us think about a mitochondrial disorder. It doesn't seem to connect with what's happening with her. And that can happen sometimes. Sometimes we see a pattern in a family history where brothers and sisters all seem to have the same thing or have features that seem to be overlapping. Sometimes we can see kind of a trail in a pattern from one generation to the next. And then sometimes we see no other pattern at all. And that was the case for Abby. Next slide, please. So I thought we could take a step back as we're talking about genetics and genetic testing, because it's important to know where our genes are. And I think most of the people here with us know that. Next slide. And it helps us to think about what a cell, how our cells work. And our cells are in all the parts of our body. There's lots of different parts of a cell. And our genetic material, for the most part, is in the nucleus. That's where over 20,000 different genes are. There's also genes in our mitochondria, which are the kind of like little lima bean pink with the yellow inside there. And the mitochondrial DNA is much smaller. There's only 37 genes, but our mitochondria do very complicated work. They take the air that we breathe, the food we eat, and turn it into energy. And so there are many, many genes that are part of that process, including ones that are nuclear DNA as well as mitochondrial DNA. Next slide. If you look at our nuclear DNA underneath the microscope, it forms chromosomes. Our chromosomes are little packages that carry our genes, and you can organize them into pairs. Next slide. That look like this, and most people have 23 pairs of chromosomes. The first pair, the first 1 to 22 pairs are usually the same in male and females. The last one codes for our sex, so this is probably a male because there's an X and a Y. Next slide. This is probably a female because there are 2 X's. And our nuclear DNA comes in pairs, one from our mom and one from our dad. And so that's how we can see sometimes sometimes it's enough to have a spelling change in 1 copy of a gene in order to have a condition. And sometimes we need to have spelling changes in 2 copies, in both copies of a gene in order for someone to have a condition. Next slide. Our mitochondrial DNA we look at very differently. We draw it as a circle, and you can see the different 37 genes that are all different colors, and it's inherited in a very different way. Next slide. So if we think back to Abby, as part of her workup, she was determined to have Lee disease as part of her clinical features, but also her genetic testing. And as many of you know quite a bit about Lee's disease, it's a progressive neurological condition, but what's listed here is often common for many different mitochondrial diseases, not just this one, where sometimes it can be caused as a spelling change in a gene that's maybe in the nuclear DNA, maybe it's in the mitochondrial DNA. It's not caused by something that someone did or didn't do. It's pretty common that people wonder if maybe there's something that happened during the pregnancy or the conception or at a certain age that caused the spelling change to happen in a gene. And often there's a team of people like the one here today that is involved in the management and the diagnosis. There are lots of different benefits to knowing the genetic cause. Jessica talked about the clinical trials and how that can be part of the criteria used to see if you're eligible. Sometimes different people in a family might have some benefits in having the genetic testing. And sometimes people wonder what the chances might be to have another child with the same condition. So it can be used for family planning. There are also many families that I've talked with where at some point in time, they underwent the genetics workup and they weren't able to come up with an answer in their genetics, in their genes at a certain time. And over the years, maybe there's more information known about what each of the genes do, or maybe the way that we look at the genes changes. But sometimes there can be a result or a diagnosis made years after the initial workup. And so it may be helpful sometimes returning to genetics, even though at the time you had a complete workup, because there may be more information available now. So if we go back to Abby, in her case, her Lee disease was caused by spelling changes in the nuclear DNA, and hers is a recessive condition, which means that both of her parents were carriers, and they are healthy people. They have one copy that is spelled correctly, and then one copy that has a spelling change in the gene that affects how it functions. And they don't have health issues, but when they have children, it's possible for each of them to pass on one copy with a spelling change that doesn't have all the information that's needed. And that gives this family some information about how it's passed on and who might have a higher chance than someone else to have a child with the same condition. But it also gives them an explanation for what happened, and that it wasn't caused by something that that happened during the pregnancy or in her early life. It's not uncommon for people to have some feelings about the genes that they have and the genes that they carry, even though we can't really control them. And so that's part of the conversation that we have in genetic counseling too. And it is a privilege to hear the stories and the feelings that people have to talk about as they think about their children and their family, which are very personal considerations. Next slide. For genetic counseling and COVID, genetic counseling, for the most part, at least here, has transitioned to telemedicine pretty easily. I think the only thing, there's some of these things echo what has been said before about telemedicine in general, but treat it like a real appointment, find a quiet place if it's possible. There may be some questions about family history information or medical history if you have it available. There may be an option to do in-person visits depending on the institution. If you do go, there may be some extra screening, and so just plan for that a little bit. And then one of the things that I've enjoyed with genetic counseling during this COVID time is that it also allows for genetic counseling with maybe an entire family. And you can do that in person as well. But I think sometimes it works a little bit better when you can all gather around the same device and have the conversation together instead of just having one person or two people and then they go back to the rest of the family to relay that information. So that has been, for me, an unexpected benefit for the telemedicine aspect with genetic counseling. If you're interested in genetic counseling, there is an NSGC website. It's a National Society of Genetic Counselors. There's a Find a Genetic Counselor tool. It's over there on the right, where you can type in where you live, your zip code, and if there's any genetic counselors in that area, if you have any questions at all that you'd like to see a genetic counselor for. There's also some information about genetic counseling and genetic counselors if you just want some more information before you contact someone. Thank you.
Hey, Gail, before you start, I just want to jump in and remind everyone one more time, the Q&A function is where we're collecting questions. We won't be opening up microphones at the end of the presentation. So if you have a question for this panel or for Dr. Dornbaum from Reneo, please type those questions into Q&A. All right, Gail, over to you.
Hi, it's a privilege to be part of the team, and I want to echo what Sophia said about the diagnostic odyssey that I know many mitochondrial patients go through, and others with family members that have rare genetic disorders. My daughter was 32 when she was finally diagnosed with her genetic disorder, and when people have asked me, why did it take so long? I say, well, she was born in 77 and it wasn't described until 82 and commonly testable until 96. So I do think she made a wonderful point in saying, keep revisiting over time because sometimes diagnostic tests evolve and more is available over time. So if I can have the next slide, I've been a nurse since 1976. I got my bachelor's degree in Michigan. And Jessica, if we can go to the next slide.
Sorry, it's not advancing.
Okay, well, I'll start talking about it and eventually it will advance. And I've been a big believer in patients being partners in their own care ever since. And so we put together what I hope will be helpful for those of you that are fortunate enough to be seen in a specialty center or even for your own specialist as your story is evolving. We put together a 2-page handout that Kara will have available, which will help you with stress prevention, in that if you organize your records, say in a 3-ring binder for a specialty evaluation, or even for your own story, as I had available when my daughter entered a natural history study at the NIH, it was wonderful to have very clear information about her symptoms, test results, physician reports. And if you're going to a specialty center, when you can prepare these documents and provide them, for example, to Dr. Haas, he really likes to have these a week ahead. Dr. Feigenbaum, her time is much better spent if she's able to have records at her fingertips rather than waiting for them to arrive in the future. So we'll go to the next slide, because I'm tasked with talking about coping mechanisms. And I'd like you to think about the square of care as a way of checking in with yourself, a way of thinking about your child in terms of how you cope. From the spiritual side of things, if you have a faith or philosophy that you follow, and that's a system where you get purpose and meaning and support, then I recommend you access that system. Let people that are leaders in your system know what you're dealing with, and let them provide support to you. If you have no formal system, but you have principles you choose to live by, be clear about that with yourself and others. There's a saying that's going around right now, be kind, and I think that's something we can all agree on. But I also think from a spiritual perspective, it's very important for you to be ready to give answers to people that sometimes can say very unkind and inappropriate things. For example, when I had ovarian cancer, I had several people say to me, "Oh, my aunt had that, she died." And I would say, well, how is that supposed to help me? And I've also had mitochondrial parents that have said, people ask them, well, why is your kid like that? Did you use drugs when you were pregnant? And they assume there's some lifestyle explanation. And so I think, again, it's important for you to think through how to educate these individuals that may be well-meaning but have inappropriate ways of asking questions. And that brings me to the social side of the square of care. An exercise I'd like to recommend for everyone is to draw a circle and write the names of 2 or 3 people in that circle that you trust and feed your soul. And those are the people that you really should spend the most of your time with. You may have other people in your constellation, but it's important to have those people that are trustworthy and generally positive to be who you spend most of your time with. Socially, you may have support groups available within the mitochondrial community. And I recommend that you balance sharing the pain, so to speak, with being a positive support, and try not to go down a rabbit hole of negativity, which some people are in that grief phase. And so pace yourself in those support systems, and be sure that it's a balance of positive support and sharing the pain. A few years ago, I had a young man that I saw with Dr. Haas. And at the end of our visit, I asked him, what have you learned from your mitochondrial disease that you might not know otherwise? And he said, people make the biggest deal out of the smallest stuff, and I just don't have time for that. So I think it's quite remarkable too what even children and kids can tell us about what they're learning. And that brings me to the psychological side of the square of care, because what we think, what we feel, how we behave can be tremendously impacted by these rare diseases that are mitochondrial problems. And I think it's important when, for example, you have a child that isn't making milestones, or as in the case that Sophia discussed, may have losses of their developmental milestones. That is the cause for tremendous grief, and it's important to be able to have supportive others that you can express your feelings to. A few years ago, I talked with a dad about his son that was their only child, and he had a rare genetic disorder. And I said, you know, it's likely that your son will never be a mini me. And he told me later, he said, when you told me that, I cried for 3 days. And I said, well, there's cortisol in tears, and it's better to let them out of your body. And then he asked me, he said, what should I do with the college fund? And I said, nobody has a crystal ball. We don't know what the future holds. Why would you give it up? And that gave him great hope, and he still talks about that today. Finally, I want to bring up the physical side of the square of care, because I think it's important to, while you're dealing sometimes with issues of grief and loss, to also optimize the best possible function for yourself or your child, and do whatever you can to support and care for your physical health. Drinking water, getting adequate rest, eating dark fruits, dark vegetables, dark grains, support movement that's going to optimize your physical function. And I think one of the things that can be very difficult for patients is moving from being a human doing to being a human being. And so find the simple things that you can still get pleasure from: a tabletop garden, having friends who want to do something to help put up a bird feeder in your yard where you can watch the birds, and dictating an encouraging message to a friend. Keep reaching out and giving, because that will continue to give you a sense of comfort and help. So I think that the final slide that I want to just remind everyone about is that our thoughts, our behavior, our feelings are closely linked. Awareness is the beginning of change. And if you find yourself going down a rabbit hole of discouragement and depression, you feel anxious all the time, you no longer get pleasure in much of what life has to offer, I do encourage you to seek help through a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a therapist. And the best outcomes for depression, anxiety are medication and counseling. So I want to thank you for these moments. And as I said, it's a real privilege to be part of this team and to have this time with all of you, because we really treasure and learn so much from our patients. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Gail. Richard, do you have some concluding remarks you want to make?
Not really. I think, COVID is going to be with us for a long time, but we're learning to cope with it, and we're going to move on despite it. And we will soon have treatments available to mitigate its effects. So I think everybody needs to try to be optimistic, even though we are in a tough world at the moment.
Great.
And I want to thank all of our speakers here, who I think did a great job.
And Dr. Feigenbaum, anything you wanted to add?
No, I don't think so. I think everybody covered it more than well. And I look forward to the Q&A.
Yeah, and that's where we find ourselves. So again, thank you to all the team from UCSD. Dr. Dornbaum, if you're still on, maybe you can come back on camera as well.
Sure.
We've had a few questions come in, and maybe I'll start with you, Dr. Dornbaum, but the Reneo presentation, a very simple one, just to start out. One of the participants wanted to clarify, is the upcoming clinical trial a phase 2 or a phase 3 clinical trial?
We're
not so simple.
not a simple answer. We actually, we are planning, when we planned this, we planned it as a phase 2 trial. And I have to tell you that, interestingly, we had conversations with the regulatory agencies. And what they told us is the design of your trial is very sound. It's very logical. It makes a lot of sense to us. And we envision that if this study is successful, probably that would be what all we need to use as evidence of efficacy. So they basically told us this could potentially be a phase 2 or a phase 3. So, but what I would call this, instead of calling it a phase 2 or phase 3, I would call it a late stage development trial.
Yeah, obviously still a focus on safety, efficacy, but potentially the data will be collected that could lead to a regulatory approval.
Approval, yes.
Yeah, so I think this is an important educational opportunity, right, for the patient community on the webinar here tonight, that it's not always cut and dry. It depends. Every intervention is different, but the message is this will be looking at both safety, efficacy, and could lead to an approval if the data were supportive of that.
And Phil, particularly for rare diseases, I would say a lot is being heard in the news about bashing the FDA or talking good about the FDA or bad, but I can say that we deal with very professional individuals at the FDA, and they understand the plight and the difficulty that patients with PMM go through, and they want to be helpful. So they're going to look at the data in the best possible way to make the right decision.
And while we're on the topic of this intervention and this clinical trial, there was a question asked: are nuclear DNA mutations eligible as well as mitochondrial DNA mutations from a genotype point of view?
Not in the first trial. In this next trial we're going to do. In this next trial we're only going to enroll patients who have mitochondrial gene defects.
Okay.
As was presented earlier, the inheritance and the manifestation of these genetic mutations is very different if they come from the nucleus of the cell or if they come from the mitochondria itself. And so we're focusing on the mitochondrial gene defects. Eventually, we may be able to expand to the larger population.
Right. And as you can imagine, there are a lot of people listening or participating in this that maybe don't fit in one of those categories or are wondering, what might that mean for us long term? If the drug is successful, becomes FDA approved, might there be the opportunity to extend this to other populations then of mitochondrial disease patients?
There would be a lot of interest in doing that, definitely. A problem, the problem with doing clinical trials, and particularly PMM, when you read about PMM clinical research, the main difficulty we encounter is this variability that we observed among patients, and that trying to reduce that variability is very important to be able to have a successful trial.
Excellent. So I'm just going to kind of refer over to here. I do want to switch gears over to the COVID topic because that's so timely and important as well. Dr. Haas' team, you guys can decide who's best to answer it, but what sort of precautions? You talked about the mask and specific types of masks, Dr. Haas, but what else should the mitochondrial disease community be thinking about in terms of precautions? And is there, over time now, we're almost 6 months into this pandemic, right? In terms of we've been dealing with it, some readout on how the mitochondrial disease community has been impacted by COVID-19.
Well, why don't I start and have the other team members weigh in? Firstly, the actual effect of COVID on mitochondrial disease patients is still largely unknown. We have concerns that they're going to be more susceptible to infection, but I'll share one particular case. So I have a patient who's in her early 20s who's very severely affected, and her mother came down with COVID. They lived together, and strangely, the 20-year-old did not develop COVID disease. And I actually don't know of any of our mitochondrial patients who have developed COVID symptoms. So I think generally, although we're fearful that there's an increased risk if you do catch COVID because of all the complications of mitochondrial disease, it doesn't seem to happen very often. And that may be in part because our patient population is being very cautious and self-isolating, but also even in situations, as I just described, you don't necessarily catch the disease if you're in contact with someone who's affected. Having said that, we don't want anyone who has an ill family member coming to the clinic or even interacting with other families or people, and until everything is clear in the home setting, which generally means a 2-week quarantine period. When we have patients coming to the clinic, they are temperature tested and have a questionnaire carried out. And if we have any investigations that have to be done, such as brainwave tests, EEG, where they're going to be in close contact with one of our staff members, then they have to be COVID tested prior to that. And Jessica, why don't you run through again what the requirements are for the clinical trial setting?
For clinical trials, you have to, have your temperature taken. You have to answer like 27 and an increasing number of questions about every symptom that's been related to COVID ever. You have to wear a mask, of course. If you don't have a mask, they'll give you one. So that's one thing I know. Some people have asked me if they think, if the people at the door, which are usually nurses, don't think your mask is appropriate, they'll give you one. You have your temperature taken. They won't let you in if you have a fever. And
the staff is screened as well, incidentally.
Yes.
We go through the same screening.
Yeah, and the staff for research usually are wearing masks as well as face shields over the mask. That's the current kind of standard thing, especially when working with kids. Some of the kids are not able/willing to wear the masks. So
yeah, so maybe the take-home message is that there's inconveniences for sure, right, for everyone, from the healthcare provider side to the patient side, but they can be overcome, and clinical trials and clinical visits are just so important, right, to the well-being of the patient, that it's worth it, right? It's worth the extra effort to do it. And I hope people feel motivated to participate in clinical research despite these inconveniences.
And the one other thing to add, of course, is that the masks are critical, but hand washing and frequent use of hand sanitizers, which are dotted all over the place in the clinics, is really important as well.
I'd also like to just make a couple of comments. One is, even if you get the virus, it doesn't mean that you're going to show the symptoms. And I have had a Mito family where both mother and child, healthy mother and affected child, tested COVID positive, but didn't have any symptoms or any problems. Now the child does not have any muscular problems, so there's no respiratory or breathing problems. So if there's a little bit of congestion or cough, it wouldn't really have affected her, but she didn't develop a fever or anything else. And the other thing that, we can do most of it on telemedicine. As Dr. Haas mentioned, the new patients are more of a challenge. But blood testing and coming into the laboratory is often very scary for families because they see other families being tested for COVID. So to reassure our families that those other families that are being tested for COVID have been through screening. So they are not, having a high fever or a big cough or anything else. Number one. And number two, in a lot of the laboratories now, including our hospital lab, you can make an appointment. So you're not sitting around for an hour waiting for your blood test. We do a lot of monitoring, and it's important to keep up with those appointments. That's it.
Yeah, so on the COVID front, Dr. Haas, Dr. Peter McGuire at the NIH has an open study. The Rare Disease Clinical Research Network also has a kind of an open survey going on the impact of COVID on mitochondrial disease patients. To the best of my knowledge, the NIH study is still open, and if patients are not yet participating in this, that they still can. Have you heard any initial feedback out of that group in terms of what they're finding with regards to impact on the mitochondrial disease community?
So actually, I just got an email from Peter McGuire after asking him.
Nice.
He says that he knows of a handful of patients, 4 to 5 patients who have had COVID, and one patient did pass away from COVID-related complications.
That's actually the first case I've heard of a fatality in the community.
Yep. So that's part of the NIH study, and they're, as far as I know, still interested in documenting the presence of COVID disease.
Yes, there's sort of an impact on family longitudinal survey, but it's transitioning to a clinical study, right, where they'll actually follow up with patients at various clinical sites too. So this is another case of an opportunity, right, to learn out of what everybody's facing. But the good news is I think some of the initial concerns were that ours was a community that could be at increased risk, right, because of the nature of mitochondrial disease, but that hasn't necessarily played out that way.
Right. So I think that's very encouraging. Only 4 or 5 patients in a national study. Of course, that doesn't capture everybody, but that's good to know.
So, Dr. Dornbaum, maybe just to jump back to Reneo for a second here. The trials will be, the trial you hope to have open in late this year or early 2021. It's not actively recruiting yet. So again, I want to make sure that we're sending the right message here to our community. This is a little bit of a hold in place, and once the sites are set up, announcements will go out. UMDF will be promoting all of the sites available, including UCSD. You would expect that that might come over the next several months, the details around that.
Correct. Correct.
Great. Yeah, just wanted to make sure we got the right message out there. Dr. Huss, there was a question, last week we did a webinar together with Dr. Stackpole, University of Florida, about DCA for pyruvate dehydrogenase complex deficiency. There was a question asked, will you be a site for that trial?
Actually, no. We're not one of the clinical trial sites for dichloroacetate. We have a lot of experience with it. Many years ago, we did our own trial of dichloroacetate and actually reported on the neuropathy complications that were happening to some of the mitochondrial patients. But as far as pyruvate dehydrogenase is concerned, I think there are probably 8 different sites now, maybe more. And we didn't really have enough patients with pyruvate dehydrogenase, I think, to participate. But also, we're really doing a lot of other clinical trials as well. So since that one is well covered, and Peter and team are doing a really great job,
Sure.
I think we're not participating. Although Annette does have experience with working with Dr. Stackpole directly, right?
Yeah, from my Toronto days, as well as experience with dichloroacetate, because in Canada it is obtainable. I have referred PDH patients, family, just up the road, and I'm sorry, I'm blocking whether it's Los Angeles or Irvine, but 1 or 2 hours up the road from San Diego. So if the person who's asking is from our area, that's where we would refer for the dichloroacetate.
Yeah, and again, the UMDF website has all the details on active clinical trials, including links to clinicaltrials.gov that Jessica and others talked about, where you can really get to the details on which sites and where you can get access and find out if you're eligible to be part of that clinical trial. We're going to have to wrap it up here soon, but Dr. Haas, there's a topic that came up that I think is always worth revisiting. It's not the easiest. There was a consensus paper put out about the appropriate use of certain drugs with mitochondrial disease or drugs that should not be used in combination with mitochondrial disease. And we know, right, as a patient advocacy group that's caused some anxiety, that it perhaps came across as dogma, as this is how it has to be. But I think this is there was a question asked about it. I think it's another opportunity from a very respected healthcare practitioner in the mitochondrial disease space, a Mito doc. Help put that in context of what was the goal of that exercise and what came out of it. How is that best used by our patient community?
Well, I think the idea of that kind of article, and we've participated in one as well, talking about treatments and avoiding certain things, is to try to alert people to potential problems. But there are very few drugs that are really known to be dangerous for mitochondrial disease patients. That much of the rest of it is theoretical. And so if there are other options available, it's nice to know which are drugs that are under some suspicion. But this system that was used, called the Delphi system, is really a matter of getting experts in the field to say what they think is the best thing to do about a particular question. And it gives a consensus view, but it's not a fact. It's not generally proven that this is what you should do. And so this consensus sort of statement is a guideline. And there are many medications that patients have to be on that we think may be more risky for mitochondrial patients, but they still need them and are doing better with that treatment. So I think every patient is individual. Everyone has a different manifestation of mitochondrial disease. And you really need to work with your own doctor, your own healthcare provider, to look through this complex collection of recommendations and decide what's the best treatment regime for you. The only drug that I would highlight that I'm really concerned about is sodium valproate, because we know that for a number of mitochondrial disease patients, Depakote or Depakote or sodium valproate can precipitate a severe crisis.
And that's often prescribed for seizures, is that correct? Or?
Yes, it's generally prescribed for seizures, but psychiatrists also use it a lot for mood disorders. And I think it has to be used very, very cautiously. I have patients who are on it because it was the only option, but it's not a first choice drug by any means.
All right. Well, take-home messages, please use that patient community as a starting point for a discussion with your healthcare provider about your situation. There are no hard and fast rules when it comes to mitochondrial disease. So, there's benefit in bringing the experts together and having these discussions, but ultimately, your mitochondrial disease is your mitochondrial disease and has to be discussed with your doctor who knows your situation best. Well, we've already gone quite a bit past our intended 1 hour. There was such great content. Thanks to all of the UCSD gang that participated, really great information on a lot of different topics. And Dr. Dornbaum as well from Reneo Pharmaceutical. We're really excited. Thanks to your company for continued interest in developing therapeutics for mitochondrial disease. And we look forward to continuing to partner with you here as your clinical trial plans progress. I think we'll wrap things up at this point. Just a quick reminder that we'll be back in October. We have a slate of speakers from the Mayo Clinic who are going to focus on making the most of the holidays. So look for updates from us on that front. And thank all of you, patients, caregivers, family members that participate in these webinars. We bring the programming for you, but it's your feedback and your questions that make them most valuable. So with that, we'll wrap it up and we'll say goodbye to everybody until next time.